Why? It's a very simple but a very important word. Why is a word that comes up a lot in our day-to-day lives. Maybe not the word itself, but the general idea of asking questions, especially when it comes to young children. If you've ever had a conversation with a toddler, it probably went something a little bit like this.
You're asked how something works, you explain it, and then they ask you, but why? You explain, and then they ask you, but why again? And you keep repeating it until you frustratedly say you don't know, and then, but why? You see, we only have so many layers of knowledge before our wells run dry, but when you're a kid, that just isn't enough. It's natural to be curious, and you see, we were all that toddler once in our lives. We wanted to understand everything, or as close to everything as we could get at that age. Eventually, though, we do stop asking why, but the desire to know things doesn't go away. It becomes a subconscious thing that manifests itself in more subtle ways. We never stop being curious, we just become more content with not knowing, plus we tend to have other things to worry about. But we never stop wondering why things are the way they are. You know, we human beings love to know things, and we equally also love the feeling of curiosity as well. Just as much fun as it is to know something is also that moment when the thing that you don't know slowly becomes the thing you do know, the joy of learning. And it could be something like a riveting conversation, an interesting storyline in a TV show or a movie, or a topic that piques your interest in a YouTube video. Sometimes the idea of something being unknown is enough to make us turn around and see what it is. Now, for some people who can't remain content with that desire to understand things is, well, to oversimplify things, why we have science. Most of the things in our modern world exist because someone got curious and discovered something that the rest of the world found useful and profitable. But it can be easy to take for granted all the accurate scientific facts that we have these days. For most of human history, we didn't know what we do today, or if we did, it was a much more incomplete picture. We might know that, say, like a certain plant might be useful for medicinal purposes, but we wouldn't know exactly why it was helpful. And so we come back to that magical and frustrating word, why? You see, one of the ways that ancient peoples tried to make sense of things was through storytelling, and a particular type of storytelling we now refer to today as myth. Now, every culture that existed in ancient times had their own share of myths, but the kind we're going to be talking about today is the classical mythology of ancient Greece. You see, classical mythology existed to answer a lot of questions, be it the origin of different aspects of nature, humanity, or culture as a whole. Myth was a tool that allowed people to make sense of the unknown in a satisfying way. Oftentimes, these stories were told in the form of poetry accompanied by music to crowds. The ancients didn't have the same avenues of entertainment that we do today, so storytelling was just as much about the community as it was about any individual. It can be easy to look back on the explanations provided by myths and look down at the backwardness of ancient cultures, like, get a load of these guys, they really thought that the reason we have winter is because Demeter has separation anxiety. Ha! What a bunch of goobs! But it's important to remember that people still continue to need explanations for things in ways that are approachable. Not everyone can comprehend the minutiae of any given topic, but people still like understanding things. Think of fairy tales that we still tell children today. Sometimes a story can help explain things and help it get across in a way you normally wouldn't be able to if you were just explaining it in plain terms. And myths provided that sense of understanding in a time when better explanations weren't a thing. So somewhere, once upon a time, someone asked, why do the seasons change? Why do we use laurel trees to make our wreaths for the sports celebrations? Why do those stars look like a person? And myths were born. So why bring all this up now? Well, because there's a lot going on that requires explanation. Things are really, really bad these days, from poverty to climate change to growing inequality to the abuse of those in power against those without, and many, many more things. It feels like everything is falling apart, and the first thing you might think is, well, why? Now, the real explanation for why things are the way they are is more complicated than I can break down in a single video, but fortunately for us, there's a myth for all of our modern troubles, a myth that attempts to explain why our world is the way it is, and, maybe if we're lucky, show us the way that it could be. Hello, ladies, gentlemen, and all you fine folks in between and beyond. My name is Doug, but you can call me the Pink Punk, and welcome to this video essay on Hadestown. For those of you unfamiliar, Hadestown is a musical that premiered on Broadway in 2019, adapting the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Written by Anais Mitchell originally in 2006, it has gone through many iterations from concept album into the Broadway show we know today. Throughout our discussion, we'll be breaking things down into parts. An early analysis of the characters and what they represent, coinciding with the first half of the play. As we examine the second half of the musical, we'll look at the implications of the events and character arcs as they reach their conclusion. Finally, we'll conclude on our own as we put everything together and really try to see what Hadestown can teach us about our world through this timeless tragedy, and maybe understand why our world is the way it is in the process. As we go forward, I want to lay out a baseline for what I mean when talking about the classical and mythological tradition. Classical myth was a part of the religion of ancient Greece. These stories weren't told in isolation. Most of them predate written word altogether. They were passed down from person to person throughout history, but were shared communally, and as such can tell us a lot about the cultures that they come from. Classical myth was used to explain why things are the way they are, but not just as a simple, this god did this and that's why we have that. It wasn't an explanation for the sake of having one. There was a deeper meaning to it. It tried to take the seemingly meaningless functions of nature and give them a story to bring it to life. By bringing life to the inanimate, to nature, and personifying it, it allowed a person to understand why things were the way they were on a deeper and more personal level. But why was this important? Why understand why? Well, one major reason was that through understanding, a person can better accept the world around them. So, one of the major things that myth tried to do was provide explanations so that people could cope with the world. Hadestown is not a classical myth like we described, but it does continue the classical tradition. While not giving us the reasons for things like the seasons or the weather, Hadestown attempts to provide explanations for the hard-to-understand concepts of the modern day. From broad topics like inequality, labor exploitation, and poverty to more intangible things like climate change and capitalism itself. Hadestown attempts to provide us with an explanation for these things through both the intimate and the grandiose. By personifying these complex topics, it can make it relatable and understandable for us. My hope today is to break down some of the clever ways the show tackles these complex issues while both being a contemporary Broadway musical, but also serving as an example of classical myth in practice. Now, while I would love nothing more than for you to watch this video all the way through, even if you know nothing about Hadestown, this is the part of the video when I tell you to go listen to the show if you haven't already and read a synopsis of the original myth while you're at it. There will be many spoilers for the show going forward, and while we will be going over a lot of the story, I fear that it won't make quite as much sense if you aren't already familiar with this musical. With that out of the way, let's actually start examining this story. I'd like to start with the world building, as I feel it will help us focus the discussion about what the musical is trying to tell us. One of the first lines of the play establishes that the play, while taking place in a physical location, the time and place aren't important.
Once upon a time there was a railroad line.
The musical is mythological in the most literal sense of the word, i.e., it follows the logic of myth, meaning that the story is as literal and figurative as it needs to be in order to get its point across, sometimes simultaneously even. I think the best example of this in practice within the show itself would be nature, or better yet, the seasons themselves. You see, the show at first describes the world in vague terms like times were hard, but as we progress through the story, we get the information that the seasons are out of whack. There is no spring or fall, only summer and winter. We later learn the reason for this is Persephone, whose arrival is supposed to bring about spring, always arrives late and leaves early. Furthermore, the reason for her erratic schedule is her husband, Hades, the king of Hadestown. So we see in practice how the story is laying out its world. We're first presented with an idea we can relate to, hard times. Then we're presented with more outlandish details, like a world with messed up seasons. Then finally we're given a far more out there concept, the seasons being tied to a person. But because the show built to that reveal, it doesn't seem as far-fetched. It's part of the brilliance of the show. It uses a style called fantastical realism, but you could also say it's being mythological in practice. It makes sense in a myth for the seasons to be tied to a person. The erratic seasons being caused by discord in a relationship is trying to establish a tangible reason for this seemingly unexplainable thing. Not only that, but this first example lays out the groundwork for us so that every other fantastical world-building element is a little more easier to digest afterwards. Like I mentioned earlier, this show, when viewed as a myth in the style of classical myths, is trying to provide an explanation for something in our modern day. In this case, climate change. And it does so through story and personification. To focus this discussion, we need to start with our main protagonists, Orpheus and Eurydice. In relation to our world, they very clearly represent the working class. In the realm of myth, they're mortals. During the introduction of Hadestown, through both the lyrics and costuming, the point is made that one's class is tied to one's divinity, or the lack thereof. Orpheus and Eurydice are going to be providing to us the perspective of the working class, and we're going to see what the show is trying to say by having them embody this group of people. It's not enough just to say these kids are poor and that's it. We're going to be examining why these characters and what about this story, this tragedy, are we supposed to glean about our world from them. Orpheus and Eurydice are characters that stand in a kind of juxtaposition to each other at the start of the show. They have different experiences in their lives, and it informs the ups and downs of their relationship. Eurydice is described as a hungry young girl, at the mercy of whichever way the wind directs her. Having known only struggle, she admits to Orpheus early on that she can't even remember a spring or fall. She's never lived in a world in balance. Survival is her primary motivation, and it's what informs her decisions later on in the show. Eurydice in this version of her story has a lot more agency than in the original myth. This agency makes her a far more compelling character, not only just because it transforms her from a passive character into a dynamic one, but because she represents the working poor, people just trying to survive. Because she represents this kind of experience, her choices and the nuance within them informs us of the nuance of our world as well. Orpheus, in contrast, is hopeful and seemingly a little naive. While being described as a poor boy, our attention is drawn to his singing ability and the way he can make people see a better potential world. Orpheus is a muse's son. A muse was a being in classical myth that possesses a supernatural talent for music, often associated with the gods of Olympus. Gods are an analog of the upper classes. Orpheus's connection to them through his mother informs us of a type of privilege. Orpheus is under Hermes' guardianship at the start of the play, a connection he has because of his heritage. His living situation has afforded him a reprieve from the worst that the world has to offer. Orpheus is still of a lower class, though. He is frequently referred to as a poor boy and is keenly aware that the world is in a sorry state. But one could conclude that Orpheus's hope for a better world is partially informed by the fact that he hasn't suffered in the same way that Eurydice has. I point out his privilege not to condemn his viewpoints as somehow less valid or genuine, but rather to express how a person's viewpoint is colored by their experiences. Orpheus's view is framed as the correct one, but it doesn't do us well just to accept it at face value and be done with it. Orpheus and Eurydice both have valid reasons for why they see the world the way that they do, and by examining the deeper meaning within them and understanding that these were deliberate creative choices, we start to see what the story is trying to tell us. You see, this story is going to end the same way it always has. No matter how many times you watch or listen to it, it's always going to end the exact same way. It draws attention to this. But because of the choices made about these characters, it makes that ending and the events that lead to it more meaningful. The choice to tie the tragedy of Orpheus and Eurydice to the working class is deliberate. along with the idea that the circumstances that lead to their tragedy is beyond their control. But let's put this idea into practice, shall we? I think the best example from the early parts of the musical that really articulate this idea of the characters bringing different perspectives to life is the way that Orpheus and Eurydice fall for one another. Orpheus is basically smitten at first sight, right? But Eurydice takes some convincing. While she indulges his flirting, seeing his actions in a cynical light, Orpheus is genuine and earnest throughout. We see how idealism and hope that Orpheus represents is trying to win over the cynicism and doubt that Eurydice carries. It isn't until Orpheus sings an incomplete version of his famous song that Eurydice starts to take him seriously. You see, when he sings his incomplete song, a flower appears in his hand, brought to life by his song. In this moment, as he tells her that his song is going to fix things, she has tangible proof that he's actually capable of changing things. This is the moment that she starts to believe that he may be right, so she sticks around a little bit longer to see. It isn't until Persephone returns that Eurydice actually opens up her heart to him. You see, when Persephone arrives, she brings summer, the warmth, the bounty, all that good stuff. And for a short time, there's comfort and security. It's only when these things are present that Eurydice starts to feel like she can let her guard down. And through these events, if you see Eurydice as a representative for the working class, in particular those so focused on survival that they don't have time to indulge in hope, then her acceptance of Orpheus is symbolic of the acceptance of hope. The reason she does so is because she has that tangible proof that there's something to base this hope off of. Because she couldn't imagine a world where she wasn't struggling. In our own world, with the constant stream of depressing news we see on top of any of the daily crap that we have to deal with, it can be easy to adopt a similar mindset. It's easier to cope with the harshness of life if you aren't expecting things to go your way. But through Eurydice, we see that this isn't permanent, that maybe on some level, all of us want to feel that way. Might actually want to think that things will turn out alright, if we only had proof that it would. I want to take a second to talk a little bit more about Orpheus here and examine how the way that he sees things and how the show not only provides us with examples of contemporary issues, but it also does so in a very timeless way. You see, Orpheus sees things how they could be, right? I also mentioned that his hope comes from partially that he is kind of privileged in the sense that he doesn't suffer as much as other people do. And that allows him to see things in a more positive light, right? But what exactly does he represent? Of course, he's a part of the lower class in the show, the mortals. He obviously represents the sense of hope, the viewpoint of people who believe things can change and try to enact that change. I think another very obvious example you could argue is that Orpheus represents a kind of starving artist trying to make the world better through their art. So you could say that he's meant to not only represent a hopeful person, but also a hopeful artist trying to fix things. When discussing Orpheus's viewpoint, having these interpretations in mind is important. But I also want to draw attention to the way that Orpheus thinks, how he sees the world. He sees how things could be, in spite of the way that it is. He believes that despite how bad things are, that they can get better. His belief that the things wrong with the world are something that can be fixed, instead of something that is an immutable fact, makes him the perfect counter to the manufactured consent of the world around him. The prevalent belief expressed by those in the world of Hadestown is that everything is bad, and there's not anything anyone can really do to fix it. And because they believe that, things remain broken. But Orpheus and his songs stand in contradiction to that. And I would argue the thing that makes him able to sing the flower into his hand, makes his music work the way that it does, is the belief that things can change. Orpheus doesn't just see the world for what it could be, he also sees things as they are. He can recognize on some level, however subtly, that the world is fixable. I bring up these observations about Orpheus, his character, and his way of seeing things because I feel they help us better understand the arc of Orpheus throughout the rest of the show. We know he's going to fail to bring Eurydice home. It's inevitable. It's the myth. He's set up to fail by both the narrative of the show and by Hades. But I bring up these ideas so when we do examine that failure, we can separate the hurt we feel from that failure, from experiencing this as a story, and find a message worth hearing. I bring it up so maybe we can figure out why. Which brings me to the gods. For this bit here, I mainly want to focus on Hermes and Persephone. I'll be giving Hades a lot more focus later, but he will be important for some of what we go over here. It's important to acknowledge what the gods once represented in classical mythology and what they come to embody in this musical. You see, the gods were representations of aspects of nature, from the storms to the seasons and everything in between. And especially back then, nature was something that was beyond human control, above our influence. So their station in this musical reflects that. You see, if the two mortal lovers represent the working class in this musical, then the gods obviously represent the upper class. Now this is pretty explicit in a lot of ways. We already discussed the costuming for one. You see, the gods offer a very nuanced take on the conflict between classes. The gods don't actually see themselves as bad guys, even Hades. All the gods think in some way they're helping. Hermes takes care of Orpheus and tries to guide him. Persephone shares the bounty of summer with the surface and smuggles in bits of nature to the workers in Hadestown. And Hades? Well, he gives people jobs in these crazy times they find themselves in. But none of the gods are quite aware just how negatively they are affecting mortals. Or if they are, they aren't doing anything really about it. You see, Hermes is implied to be the host of the train station at the beginning. His place is where Persephone arrives and where all the mortals will go when she gets there. When she leaves, where else is there to go but get on the train to Hadestown? And not to mention, while he does try to get Orpheus to notice Eurydice's struggles during the storm, he doesn't do much to actually help their circumstances. Or take Persephone, who, while she does bring summer and a literal breath of fresh air, her song is loaded with excuses and gives rather disingenuous advice. These excuses dodge any responsibility or even acknowledgement of her own part in how bad things are. In Hades, well, we'll get to him. I bring up these ideas, though, not to try to paint these gods as secretly villainous monsters, but rather show that the gods don't face the same consequences that Orpheus and Eurydice do. They either indirectly or directly benefit from Hadestown. Hermes and Persephone on some level do care, and they try to help the protagonists. And by the end of the story, they are fully on the side of the young lovers. But what makes them frustrating is that for a while, they only make a play at being a part of the struggles of the working class, but they're completely removed from the consequences of said struggle. Like, could you imagine that level of disconnect? Hermes and Persephone both mean well, but they failed to really help during the first half of the story. If anything, they're problematic allies. I bring this up not to say that they are bad or responsible for the tragedy of the show, but rather to point out how even the best intentions don't always translate to actual help. They have different roles in the story. Persephone is clearly a victim of Hades, and Hermes is our narrator, so you could argue they can't do much to change things. But, I think seeing this, and tying their ineffectiveness to help with their class, can show those of us with privilege, whatever form it may come in, that our lack of first-hand experience can get in the way of doing actual good. And I think another clever idea presented by this world building is that it presents a world with no middle class. While Orpheus has more privilege than Eurydice in some regards, when the chips are down, he's viewed as just another poor boy working on a song. By connecting wealth to godhood, something utterly unattainable for anyone ever, but especially those of us experiencing the show, I think what Hadestown is trying to show us is that there is no real middle ground for us to see ourselves in. Either we see ourselves in these gods, or we're these young kids just trying to survive. I think it makes the drama for us all the more real then. We have to see ourselves in those who are struggling, empathize with their journey, and really put us in their shoes when their tragic end comes around. All these things we've discussed, from the world building to the characters, have helped us lay out the kind of world we find ourselves in during the first act of the show. I hope. We see how the state of the world, out of tune with the seasons in disarray, is a fantastical way of exploring the idea of climate change. That the characters of the show, while living in this world, mirror perspectives of people in our own. The payoff for all the setup that the show does with these ideas comes in the form of Hades. Hades! Where do I start? Hades is an exploration of the concept of capitalism. Now, capitalism is quote-unquote controversial for a lot of good reasons, and a lot of people have strong opinions on it. And I want to clear up a few misconceptions made by people. One of them being that capitalism is a simple buying and selling of goods. That's not true. That's what would probably be referred to as commerce, or even more simply, trade. Capitalism is a form of commerce that is focused on capital or wealth, i.e. money and goods and the materials that make goods. Capitalism is about acquiring this capital and accumulating more of it. With that being said, I want to be sure we're on the same page with this interpretation. Hades is coded as wealthy in the same way Hermes and Persephone are, through their costuming and status as gods. But what I want to be clear about is that Hades isn't just simply representing a modern idea of wealth or power, but also a timeless one. And so when I critique him in capitalism, it's not just a critique of our current ideas of wealth and power, but also the ideas of wealth and power as a whole. At some points, Hades' actions can be clearly read as an analog to the actions of capitalism or capitalists. At other times, he feels like he represents something deeper, older, more timeless, while still invoking in us images of our modern day. It creates an antagonist who feels like a much deeper critique of power and wealth as a whole, than just merely making him an analog for someone like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. In the process of updating this character, we can draw an even more compelling observation. The gods, as previously mentioned, represented aspects of nature. This idea of presenting a human-like being who is responsible for acts of nature beyond the scope of human understanding. By following that line of thought, though, I would argue that Hades representing in part, or as a whole capitalism, depending on your interpretation, is making the case that capitalism is unto itself comparable to a force of nature. This makes his relationship with Persephone all that more interesting. The choice to have them be in opposition, not only that, but seemingly in this long, drawn-out, exhausting conflict is fascinating. We get the sense that this rift has been a problem for a very long time. Looking at their roles as gods, though, is illuminating in a way. The state of their relationship influences the state of the world, but also symbolically shows what is culturally valued has shifted. In particular, Hades becoming a god of wealth and industry. Hades, who once represented death and the earth, and Persephone, who brought life with spring to the surface, had this balance in their relationship. The show itself acknowledges this through the song Epic 1. Hades, as laid out in Epic 2, grew rich from the resources under the earth. Now, in this time when Hades' kingdom is one of industry, and his relationship with his wife is at its worst, is nature suffering. This isn't an accident. I believe the show is laying it out rather clearly that capitalism, as represented by Hades, is responsible for climate change. Another way of seeing this is by thinking of their growing apart as a symbol for industry, with its self-proclaimed ideas of innovation, progress, and expansion, no longer listens to nature if it ever did. As such, it's now causing untold damage to nature. I've been bringing up this idea through the video that because of the way the show presents itself, it allows complex issues to be presented to the audience in a way that won't trigger anyone's biases. Oftentimes people get defensive when something challenges preconceived notions, especially when talking about capitalism. But Hadestown doesn't outright say the word capitalism. It lets the implications do the talking. I'm just reading those implications out loud for you. It's similar to the metaphor for climate change we've examined already. But Hades as a symbol isn't used just to explore climate change, but also to see how capitalism has an effect on us as people. You see, you could argue that the climate change that Hades and Persephone create is an unintended consequence. They aren't meaning to do it. But when we look at the impact that their decisions have on the young lovers, and then you see Hades' actions thereafter, you start to see what Hades' intent really is. The song chants is when we start to see all the thematic layers of Hades as a character come together. As Persephone complains about Hadestown and Hades tries to win her over, on the surface, Orpheus is working on a song while Eurydice struggles to provide for them both. Over the course of the song, a mighty storm emerges and Eurydice loses what little she has. Coinciding with this, Hades and Persephone's argument reaches its fever pitch, and Hades proclaims he'll find someone who will value Hadestown in a way that Persephone doesn't. Like I said, the storm is unintentional. He doesn't mean to cause it, but his actions following it are his decision. You see, Hades goes to the surface and finds a despondent and starving Eurydice and offers her a ticket to Hadestown. Now, just prior to this, he taunted Persephone with finding someone else, right? So, the scene in a lot of ways is framed as a seduction, as an old man just trying to get back at his wife by picking up a younger girl, correct? Now, I think this framing is important for a few reasons. You see, Hades representing capitalism and Eurydice representing poverty. Hades offers her a means of survival, but her consent in this scene is dubious. She's making the choice to go with him in part because if she doesn't, she likely won't survive. You see, as symbols, they represent the way that powerful corporations take advantage of the desperation of those in poverty. But on the personal level, we see it as an old man trying to seduce a young girl. This can even give us a further perspective of the previous interpretation. It's not just that these companies are taking advantage of people. If you see Hades as a representation of these companies, as corporations and capitalism as a whole, then there's this further duplicity. It lays out this idea both in the text and the subtext that Hades, and by extension capitalism, takes advantage of the desperate in order to satisfy itself. But also looking at it from the seduction angle makes the exploitation all the more intimate. It's not just some faceless company with a smirk trying to get you to work for them. It's a mysterious old man offering you something too good to be true, but too tempting to refuse. To start this discussion about Hadestown as a place, we need to address the elephant in the room and look at one of the most infamous songs from this musical. Why Do We Build the Wall? Now, this song has taken on a lot of extra meaning within the past 6 years or so for very, very obvious reasons. It might be tempting to put down those complicated feels one gets after hearing the song for the first time. When the assumption is made that the song is political, many people might dismiss it for various personal political opinions or try to engage with the song solely as a piece of political commentary. But when one discovers the original context, then one might try to dismiss the more complicated weight it carries in favor of trying to see the song as how it fits into the context of the story, devoid of any unintended subtext. I think it's important to understand both of these viewpoints when analyzing this musical as a myth. Just as myths have taken on numerous different meanings in different retellings throughout history, we can see how all this happens just by looking at the journey of this one song. Its meaning has completely changed through no effort of the author's part due to the changing of the political climates. This is one of the few songs in the entire musical, from concept album into the Broadway musical, that hasn't had any change to its lyrics. The ideas presented by Hades, a circular chant that builds upon itself that, once free of this deeper meaning, is now forever bound to it. One interpretation is that the added political meaning takes away the deeper meaning of the song. But I think actually the deeper context added by political events makes it one of the songs that can best connect what the purpose of Hades and Hadestown, the setting, is all about. During the song, Hades urges the answers out of the workers, spurring them on. Those words were meant to evoke certain images. The contemporary interpretation of the song makes the themes of the show more explicit. It might feel on the nose, but that's only with a surface level reading. The song is a man in power taking the answers he is given by the crowd and turning it into a rallying cry. Hades takes the feelings of his workers and uses it to distract them, to harness the passion that they give him and make them passive to his abuse. Hades' relationship to the crowd is not just that of a politician in his base, but rather a business owner and his workers. Hades in Hadestown is about capitalism. The song is about the circular relationship between labor under capitalism and the circumstances that drive people to labor. It helps tie these ideas together: politician and base, boss and workers, king and subjects, God and men. The song is about so many things, but when you start to look at everything, it becomes clear that it's trying to connect these ideas of power and rulership. But why? Why try to associate gods, kings, businessmen, and even politicians together? What point is there in saying they are the same? I don't think it's an accident. Nothing in the show is. But I think about this quote when thinking about this song.
We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, very often in our art, the art of words. Ursula K. Le Guin.
Hades represents authority in all the forms that it takes. In the show, a god and a king, but in our world, also politicians and capitalists. As Hades takes Eurydice into his office to sign her contract, Persephone comes on stage and begins to offer the workers contraband from the surface. Framed like a scene from a speakeasy, the song Our Lady of the Underground frames her contraband in an interesting way. While there's some obvious references to alcohol, most of what she offers is bits of nature: wind, leaves, the sky. This framing is really important because Persephone offering nature as contraband is symbolic of how nature has become a commodity. Hadestown is so far removed from the natural state of things that literal moonshine is something to be smuggled in. It shows just how wrong this place is for a person like Persephone. Hades, in all of his attempts to impress his wife, makes a place where she can't be herself. Nature isn't allowed in the kingdom of Hades. Persephone is never going to be happy in a place like this. And I think this also brings up another aspect of Persephone I would like to talk about: her substance abuse. Now, substance abuse is a complicated topic, and there are many factors for why a person might be suffering from it, so I don't want to make light of anyone's struggles by my comparison, but rather highlight another subtle way of how this show examines why things are the way they are. You see, the above-mentioned things are reasons for why Persephone suffers from substance abuse. She's in an environment that stifles her, isolates her, and separates her from the things that she really cares about and brings her joy. And it's not just any environment, though. It's Hadestown, a place that symbolizes industry, machinery, and fabrication. All the artificiality of capitalism. What I want to argue is that the musical presents this idea that the isolation inherent to capitalism is what can compel a person to engage with substance abuse. People don't choose to become addicts. Oftentimes they find themselves in similar circumstances to Persephone. They feel trapped, frustrated, and isolated. And I think it's important that the show shows this idea through a sympathetic character, because oftentimes we believe this myth that people are the only ones responsible for their own actions, that society doesn't play any part in them. And hopefully from this analysis we can see that the show is subtly saying that that idea is wrong. And not only in Persephone, but with Orpheus and his ignorance of Eurydice, or Eurydice and her decision to leave for Hadestown. These characters often find themselves in bad places because it seems like there isn't anything else they could do. But I think we'll really start to see this idea explored as we examine Eurydice's experience in Hadestown. After signing the papers and stepping onto the line, Eurydice is thrust into the rigorous and monotonous work of Hades' factory. As she struggles, she can't get a word out of any of the other workers, who the fates tell her have forgotten everything but the memory of working, a fate Eurydice will soon share. As her memories start to fade away, she laments how all she wanted was a chance to rest and a place for her struggles to end. She's gotten that on the surface, but the deeper truth of Hadestown is that what little it provides materially, it takes a much heftier price from your soul. In my opinion, this is probably one of the least subtle metaphors in the story, but it's another continuation of this exploration of Eurydice being a representation of people in poverty and the choices they're forced to make. You see, previously we mentioned how Eurydice's choice to follow Hades was a representation of how lower class people are often forced to take whatever jobs and opportunities they can to survive. This part of her story then examines how people behave when they find themselves in those places afterwards. There's this commonly expressed opinion whenever people debate raising the minimum wage, which is some variation of, why don't they just get a better job? Now, there are a lot of reasons why this is an offensive and disrespectful view to hold, and I think Eurydice's situation does a really good job of showing why this isn't something someone can just do. If you've been stuck in a job you've hated that paid just enough for you to get by between checks, but demanded a lot of hours from you, then you can probably really relate to the condition the workers at Hadestown find themselves in. The feeling of numbness, the way that work consumes you, and the way you start to forget about everything else. These aren't that much of a theatrical exaggeration. Loads of working class people find themselves in circumstances like this. It's even more significant when you realize the promise Hades gives Eurydice to convince her is similar to the one we often hear. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The work will set you free. Work hard and you'll rise above. But it doesn't. People don't get to be millionaires from working entry-level jobs. They just make the people who employ them more rich. So hopefully you see how, like Eurydice and the other workers, people don't have the energy just to find something better. The nature of the work of Hadestown sucks the soul out of the workers, just like how corporations in our world overwork people to keep them in their place. Make no mistake, it's done deliberately, not only because people who are too exhausted to try to leave will keep working in order to survive, but it will also make it that much easier to keep them compliant. You see, just as Eurydice has resigned herself to her fate, Orpheus arrives in Hadestown to take her home. As our memories come rushing back, the two of them apologize for their mistakes, and it seems like things might actually turn around. Then Hades arrives. Confirming to Orpheus that Eurydice chose to go with him, Orpheus defiantly stands up to him, saying that they're both going to leave, regardless of the choice that Eurydice made. Hades then orders the workers to beat up Orpheus. Leaving him broken on the floor with the fates taunting his failure, Hades enters his office. This event is important because it's the catalyst for the climax of the show in a number of ways. Primarily, though, it puts Orpheus and the workers together in the same room. There's this really interesting dichotomy here. You see, the workers were the ones who attacked Orpheus, right? Hades gave the order, true, but they did the dirty work. It's a small thing, but it highlights a deeper truth about Hades and his power. It's only relevant when his people are listening to him. Much like our own world, it's oftentimes people who, in different circumstances, would be in Orpheus's shoes. They're the ones enforcing the rules for the Hades of our world. But it's also significant because of what follows. Orpheus, nearly convinced of the futility of his struggle, sings a lament of his loss, questioning if it's true that everything he's done has been in vain. As he turns to leave, he hears the singing of the workers, and, inspired by their questioning, begins to rally them, reminding us and the workers that those in power will often make convenient claims to justify said power. In this moment of great personal tragedy, Orpheus shares his grief, and through it, people around him start to realize their own problems. They start to look up. A common theme in regards to Hades throughout this musical is the phrase, "keep your head low," which the workers chant whenever he's near. This idea will have a deeper meaning with Hades himself later, but the much more tragic and immediate interpretation is there for the workers. If they want to survive, they have to keep their heads low, stay out of trouble. I mentioned just a little bit ago this idea of compliance being the goal, right? We see why Hades would want this. He desires it because it means the workers won't question and will willingly go along with the abuse of Orpheus and each other. For a lot of people in real life, their survival in this awful system we live in is conditional on them not rocking the boat and not questioning things that are going on around them. It might be said that people in my community are starving or jobless or homeless, but hey, at least I'm not, and if I don't want to end up like them, I better get back to work. Compliance is the main ingredient here, keeping your head down so the machine can keep on rolling. Hadestown perpetuates because no one who could change things there, either Hades or the workers, are looking up in order to do so. So when the workers do look up, they begin to see the world around them, start to see things for what they are. The whole thing threatens to come crashing down. So the same could be argued for our world, right? That if everyone started to look up, then it could threaten the whole system. If we just had a moment to stop, we could maybe do the same. And we did.
I want to talk about what happened in the summer of 2020. Now, most people don't need to have what happened explained again, or might find it traumatic, so I'll be providing timestamps if you want to skip the recap, or this section entirely if you want to. On May 26, 2020, George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police, which was caught on film. Following this, protests erupted throughout the city, the state of Minnesota, the country, and eventually across the world, protesting his murder among others such as Breonna Taylor's, along with police brutality and systemic racism. The protests that followed were the largest in American history. A contributing factor for this huge turnout was, amidst all of this, was the coronavirus pandemic, which had put most of the country out of work, attending school at home, or otherwise quarantined to their homes. So, while another video of police murdering a black man went viral, millions of people were at home watching it all unfold on their screens, like so many times before. But this time, people were able to come out and try to do something about it. I mentioned earlier that our society intentionally overworks people and stretches them thin in order to keep us exhausted and compliant. What occurred because of the lockdowns was that the millions of people who normally would want to do something, but would be kept from doing so in normal circumstances, found themselves with the opportunity to do so. Without the burden that work and school typically imposed on people, millions of people were able to come together and protest, one of the largest the world has ever seen. These protests terrified the powers that be. During the height of these protests, calls were made to put people back to work, in part to break up the growing number of people coming together. The truth of the matter was, millions of people making demands is a powerful thing, and these protests threatened to actually bring about change. So the powers that be were desperate to placate and return things to the status quo. For an instant, we all saw what could happen when we looked up and saw the world around us. Now, in some part, I feel that comparing these events to this show is in bad taste. I don't want this comparison to come across as me simply trying to be clever by trying to equate a real-world tragedy and the events that followed to some musical that I like. But rather, what I hope to do is demonstrate how this show is, if viewed as a modern-day myth, is explaining how our world functions and subtextually highlighting a really radical idea. This musical was written long before the events of the summer of 2020, but stuff like this has always been happening. The United States of America is a deeply racist country, and BIPOC people have suffered under it and its laws for its entire existence. So the events described in the song, if it's true, reflect the experience of solidarity in our modern day and the ability to share and inform others of what's really going on. Orpheus's lament inspires the workers around him to look up and express the discontent that they have with Hadestown. They notice the abuse they suffer and the contradictions they've believed. They come together with Orpheus through mutual understanding and a realization of how things really are. I see a parallel here to what happened last summer. We saw something terrible happen, something most of us have gotten too used to seeing, but tragic circumstances put us in a position where we were able to try to do something about it. I don't make this comparison so you can see Hadestown as the most radical or revolutionary musical, but rather to show how this piece of theater is actively trying to say something meaningful about solidarity. That we will come together and try to help one another. We just have to be able to look up.
That's why afterwards we heard calls to bring people back to work, even though the pandemic was only growing worse. It wasn't for the economy or for anyone's individual benefit. It was because people were coming together and were getting a step closer to really changing things. This movement, more than any in recent memory, shows how powerful solidarity is and how we naturally come to help one another when we have the opportunity to lift our heads just a little bit. To tie this idea back into the story, I want to examine this idea of the power of people coming together. In the original myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, Orpheus sings this song, a lament to the gods, and is given the chance to take Eurydice back to the surface with him. Now, if you've read the myth and are a little familiar with the different types of songs, then when you listen to Hadestown, there might be a little thing you catch. You see, the song that Orpheus sings to Hades is very beautiful. It's one of my favorites from the whole show. but it's not a lament. A lament, at least according to the Oxford Language Dictionary, is a passionate expression of grief or sorrow. And while Orpheus's song is passionate, it isn't about his grief or sorrow. He does sing a lament, though, but not before the gods, but the workers. In this way, I think that the show is telling us in the way that it has so many other things, that in this story, this is where the real power is. Because after this, when Orpheus and Eurydice march with the workers as Hades confront Orpheus, this lament is what leads to Orpheus eventually getting his chance to leave with Eurydice. Coming into the climax of the story, Persephone, who has heard Orpheus' song and is moved by it, tries to convince Hades to let the two young lovers go. But Hades, only seeing things through the eyes of a king, says if he does, then he'll lose everything. Letting Eurydice go is tantamount of losing Hadestown to him. To Hades, if that were to happen, it would leave him with nothing. Hadestown has come to replace Persephone in his heart. The walls he's built around him only serve to keep him trapped. Then comes in Orpheus and Eurydice and all the workers, marching, questioning if what Hades has said to them is true. Hades reasserts his dominance quickly, though, and in an act of cruel mercy demands that Orpheus sing him a song. Orpheus complies. He sings the song of Hades and Persephone's love, and the two gods dance. Hades, for a second, remembers that even without Hadestown, he still has Persephone. Orpheus and Eurydice reaffirm their love for one another. Acknowledging the mistakes they made, they promise to walk hand in hand in the future. In the moment of truth, they ask Hades for permission to leave. He replies he doesn't know if they can. Then in come the Fates, who by confirming his worst fears, they spur on his next decision. Hades, who realizes the threat to his power that Orpheus represents, sets up Orpheus's famous test. Absolving him in the eyes of his subjects, Hades gets to have his cake and eat it too. So, we might ask, why? Now that you've gotten your wife back, why are you doing this, Hades? Hades represents capitalism, and in the world of the show, if anyone has a reason for the system to keep going, it's Hades. But the choice to have Hades set up Orpheus was a deliberate one. You see, Orpheus is always going to fail. Regardless of the adaptation, he is going to turn around. But by framing it as a deliberate choice made by the man with all the power in the world right now, who's just given everything he wanted, he's given Persephone, but he's still choosing not to let Orpheus and Eurydice just go. By framing this as a choice made by Hades, instead of just the failure of Orpheus, it's giving us one of the final pieces we need to see what Hadestown is really about. So we come back to Hades and his decision. Spurred by the Fates, he decides to put Eurydice's fate on Orpheus. Orpheus can lead her home, but he can't look behind to see if she's following. In the original myth, it was a test of a single person. How far could one man go? It was a story that reminded people that no one could overcome nature, overcome death. But now it's not just him or Eurydice, it's everyone in Hadestown. As Orpheus prepares to go, the workers ask him to show the way, show how the world could be. This is a test of Orpheus's ideology. Can hope win out over doubt? It's a lot of pressure to put on one person. Too much. Orpheus was set up to fail. That's the insidious thing about it. And I see two parallels to our own world. One of the more broader ideas is that we have people representing particular movements. A lot of the social movements we know about, particularly ones we think of off the top of our heads, are usually tied to a specific person. And if that person fails for whatever reason, a lot of the momentum of those movements go with them, which is exactly what happens with Orpheus. But I think on a smaller and more personal level, we can relate that to ourselves. We're given a lot of seemingly accomplishable goals throughout our day-to-day lives. Things like cleaning, keeping in touch with friends, working, going to school, making healthy foods instead of eating out all the time, working out, etc. On paper we can do all these things, and oftentimes our hardest critics will say that we can. But just like Orpheus, sometimes the simplest things are a lot harder than they seem. But just like Orpheus, the failure may be ours, but the reason we were here in the first place isn't our fault. But even knowing that it isn't all his fault, he still fails anyways, and it hurts. In this moment, Orpheus says he once could see how the world could be, but now all he sees is how it is. It's the symbolic defeat of his ideals. With that in mind, in this final trial, where it's not only Eurydice's fate on the line, but that of all the other workers, we see how Orpheus's tragedy cuts all the deeper. What he believed in this moment, was shown to fail. It's all by design, but all the more tragic because of what was riding on it. Hades gets to stay in power. He has proof he can point to keep the workers in line, because if Orpheus failed, so will they. He gets everything he wants, because in our world, those in power will take the best you can give, then throw you back outside. They'll benefit from your hard work, but will still continue doing what they've done. They'll let you fail, and then they'll say it was all your fault.
Orpheus's failure is symbolic in this way. One of ancient myths' most tragic and personal failures is used to highlight the cruelty of our modern day. Orpheus's failure is a human one, but in this adaptation, it was desired by Hades. If Orpheus succeeds, the walls come down. If the things that Orpheus and Eurydice represent are such a threat to Hades and what he stands for, what does it say about those things? The young mortals represent us, regular people, and Hades represents not only our modern day ideas of power through the lens of capitalism, but also these old and ancient ideas of power and wealth. By exploring these ideas through these characters in this story, and in particular with this famous failure, I believe what it's trying to show us is that failure as we know it today isn't our fault. That every one of our daily screw-ups isn't the direct responsibility because of our negligence. That maybe we wouldn't turn around if we didn't have doubt placed into us by those in power.
The final number of Hadestown sees Hermes, who has just witnessed Orpheus fail at the last moment yet again. Hermes tells us not to question how this could have happened, not to ask why. He says it's an old song. For a moment, Hermes gets choked up over the emotion, inviting us to share in the grief of this tragedy. Hermes reiterates the idea that this tragedy is old, ancient. We know how it's going to turn out before it even begins. But they sing it anyways, with the hope that maybe this time it'll turn out differently. Calling upon the ideals of Orpheus, he mentions the idea of going through this tragedy again with the idea that maybe, if they see the way it could be instead of how it is, it will be different this time. As he calls out for us to imagine that future, Persephone comes back with spring, and the stage is slowly reset. The actors return to their original positions, and the play ends with the young lovers locking eyes the same way they did when the play began. The musical ends with a resolution that they are going to sing the song again, despite how it all turned out. It's a beautiful moment celebrating the human spirit and its ability to hope, despite impossible odds. I mean, what's more defiant than going into a tragedy hoping for it to turn out right? There's something really inspiring about that, despite the heartbreak, hoping it's going to turn out right. It's a powerful sentiment, and it's one that left me deeply frustrated. If you're watching or listening to the musical for the first time, this is an especially cathartic moment. It's necessary to come to terms with experiencing the tragedy. But as I was continuously going through the story again and again and again over this pandemic, reading deeper and deeper into it, I couldn't help but feel like it wasn't enough. That just going through the motions and hoping that things would turn out better wasn't the lesson I wanted to take from this story. The subtext was so rich. The actual reasons for Orpheus's failure was so obvious to me that it felt like Hermes' resolution was too passive. That, essentially, it was a person saying, yeah, that was awful, but hey, keep on going on. Don't worry, maybe tomorrow will be different. We're not going to do anything different, though. It felt like I was being told that even though I clearly saw that the world could change, I was being told at the last minute not to rock the boat, to hope passively. Hope is a powerful thing, but on its own, it doesn't change much. So I was left with this unsettling feeling that the show had copped out at the last second. You see, like a lot of people this past year and a half, I felt very trapped and powerless. Stuck inside by things outside of my control, then thrown into an awful job just to survive. It felt like the world was only getting worse and I was trapped and forced to watch it all happen. I kept wondering why, and I kept coming back to this show. It spoke to me and reflected the same feelings I had and even gave me answers. helped me see things in a different way. So much so that I decided to make this video to share what I felt about this piece of art and try to share what I thought it was saying. But I still found myself being let down by Hermes' message. I kept asking, why are you saying this? Why is this the message? Until I saw an interview with Amber Gray and Patrick Page, in which Gray said this.
The thing about activism, I've been in political activist group for 15 years. The goal is never that you're going to succeed even in your generation. The goal is just nudging the needle so that the next Orpheus who goes down, like, maybe won't turn around. And probably you're going to have like 20 who do for a while. You know, it's just about making the possibility be there, which is quite hopeful. Yeah. Possibility is more than you had before.
And then it all clicked. What Hermes is asking us to do is not just accept the tragedy in front of us, grieve, and then just keep on hoping it will get better by going through the motions. But to keep going forward just so the meter will tick. And then the entirety of the story isn't in vain. The lessons Orpheus and Eurydice learned, the reconciliation between Hades and Persephone, and the realization and solidarity of the workers, it wasn't all for nothing. Orpheus had to fail. I've repeated this idea throughout the video because it's true. As much as the ending hurts, I feel it would have been so much more offensive if the show had ended happily. If this is a myth trying to explain to us the complicated ideas of the world, and it just ended on a happy note, what would that say? That where we are now is good? No, the reason this musical is so relevant is because things are so awful right now, and what it's saying is resonating with those frustration and fears that we feel. The choice to adapt Orpheus and Eurydice's story in this way is so important because of what this tragic ending provides. It's not just the story of a young man failing to save his love from the land of the dead, but rather a poor boy who represents us and our hopes for the future, failing at the last minute. Those feelings we get when he turns around are the whole point. Just like how the workers of Hadestown realized how bad things were when Orpheus sang his lament, that's what we experience by his failure. We hope that he doesn't turn around, even though we know that he will. Every single time I listen to this, I hope that this is the time it won't happen, as crazy as it sounds. But those two feelings, the hope and then the disappointment, are enough to motivate anyone, I think. It was enough to motivate me to make this video. And this is what I meant by finding the meaning in Orpheus's failure. Because it's important to acknowledge the parts of it that were his fault, but also the parts that were designed to trip him up, and those little gray spaces in between. Tragedy was meant to provide catharsis, because no matter what time period you live in, when something horrible happens to you, you're left asking why. But tragedy doesn't always try to answer that question. Honestly, most of the time you're still left asking why after you experience a tragic story. But tragedy tried to tell us that our stories still matter even if we fail, even if we don't know why. And that's why this story is told in this way, why this tragedy is framed this way. Orpheus set out to change the world and he failed, just like so many people did before us and so many people after us. He couldn't save Eurydice and by extension the other workers. But he did get Persephone to bring spring again, because just as much as people before us failed, they got us here. As broken and as messy as it is, they got us that spring even though the winter will come and the places like Hadestown still exists. And it's like what Amber Gray said, we likely won't succeed in this generation, but we have to try. There will always be Hades trying to keep what control they have and fates to whisper our worst fears in our ears, but we can't let that stop us. The defiance that Hermes speaks of is not a passive one, but a truly brave one. But no one person can fix everything wrong with the world. We see this through Orpheus. But to still wake up and go into the world hoping we can fix things, that's what we're supposed to take from the show. It's not enough just to ask why and be content when you get an answer, but to take the message you get and to try to do those things, even though we know we'll likely fail. But why? Because here's the thing. To know how it ends and still begin to sing it again, as if it might turn out this time. Hello, hello. This is Doug.
Thank you so very much for watching this video. It means the world to me that you took a little bit of time out of your day just to listen to what I have to say. This video has been the product of over a year and a half of work, and I am so thankful that I was able to share it with all of you. So if you like what you saw today and you want to see more, feel free to subscribe. Liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing, all those things do a lot to kind of help this channel grow and help me share my stuff with more people. It would mean a lot to me if you did so. Also, I'm launching a Patreon as well. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Patreon is a service that allows you to basically throw a couple dollars my way every month. Don't think that you have to, and only donate if you're in a position to do so. If you subscribe to my Patreon, you can get certain things like your name at the end of a video, a shout out, or even early access to my scripts and future videos. Don't feel like you have to donate, and don't donate if you aren't in a position to do so. Just you watching my videos is more than enough for me. It means the world to me that you stuck it out and watched all this, and I can't wait to share what I have in store with you next. Please take care of yourself, take care of each other, remember Black Lives Matter, and I'm happy you're here. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.